lets him demonstrate that his message of reshaping the US-led global order does have appeal for other countries outside of Russia. Finally, I would note that this is a chance for Putin to have meetings with key partners that are sometimes hard to pull off because of his travel limitations given the arrest warrant.
The global financial system has for decades been anchored by institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. These institutions, created in the aftermath of World War II under the Bretton Woods framework, became the custodians of global liquidity, development financing, and the stabilization of economies facing crisis. For years, their decisions reflected the dominance of Western economies, particularly the United States and Europe, which structured global trade and capital flows around the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. Yet, in recent years, the balance of power has been shifting. Rising powers, particularly those grouped under the BRICS coalition, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, with more nations seeking entry, have begun openly challenging the hegemony of the dollar-based financial system. This evolving contest between Western-led financial institutions and the multipolar ambitions of BRICS provides fertile ground for new technologies such as blockchain-based digital assets, especially networks like XRP, Stellar XLM, and Hedera HBAR, which increasingly appear positioned to act as the neutral infrastructure for cross-border value transfer in a divided financial order. The push for a multipolar financial order is largely driven by frustration with the perceived inequities of the IMF and World Bank system. Critics from emerging markets argue that the IMF's structural adjustment programs, its lending practices, and its insistence on austerity conditions disproportionately burden debtor nations while consolidating Western influence. For example, loans extended to African or Latin American states often came with economic conditions that reshaped domestic policy in ways that benefited Western creditors and multinational corporations more than the local populations. This dynamic fostered resentment and fueled a desire among developing countries to reduce dependency on Western-dominated financial frameworks. BRICS, in response, has not only criticized these institutions but also set about constructing its own alternatives, such as the New Development Bank, NDB, and discussions about a BRICS currency system that could challenge the dollar. Where this shift becomes especially relevant to the cryptocurrency landscape is in the pressing need for neutral, trust-minimized, and technologically advanced rails for international settlements. The dollar's dominance has meant that global transactions, even between countries outside of the United States, often settle in dollars through correspondent banking channels. This process is slow, expensive, and vulnerable to sanctions. For BRICS countries, which increasingly seek to trade with each other in their local currencies, or in new mechanisms that avoid the dollar, blockchain-based payment networks are emerging as attractive solutions. XRP, with its deep ties to Ripple's work in cross-border payments and its integration with banking infrastructure, naturally becomes part of this conversation. Similarly, Stellar's reputation as a low-cost remittance and payment network fits into the vision of facilitating fast, currency-agnostic settlements. Hedera, while distinct in its governance structure, adds another layer, enterprise-grade consensus and tokenization frameworks that could underpin the infrastructure of a multipolar settlement layer. The IMF and World Bank are not blind to these shifts. Both institutions have increased their focus on digital currencies and tokenization. The IMF has published extensive papers on central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, acknowledging their potential role in cross-border trade. The World Bank, too, has piloted blockchain-based bond issuances and tokenized financial instruments. Yet the challenge remains. If the future is multipolar, then the institutions historically aligned with Western dominance must find ways to remain relevant while integrating technologies that may reduce the centrality of the US dollar. One plausible outcome is that these institutions lean on blockchain networks that appear neutral and not tied to any one nation's political agenda. XRP, XLM, and HBAR, all with varying degrees of enterprise and institutional adoption, could be contenders for this role. The BRICS countries are also experimenting in this direction. Russia and China, heavily sanctioned and increasingly cut off from the dollar system, have been actively promoting alternatives. China's digital yuan project represents one approach, state-controlled, centralized digital currency meant to rival dollar dominance. However, the global uptake of such a system is unlikely to succeed without neutral intermediaries. Many other BRICS members and allies prefer solutions that don't cede control to one dominant player. In this vacuum, blockchain projects like Stellar, Ripple, and Hedera offer value because they provide decentralized, technologically advanced, and globally accessible frameworks. Their utility isn't limited to retail or speculative trading. They are specifically designed to solve the inefficiencies of cross-border settlement. This makes them credible candidates to become the plumbing of a multipolar world order where neither the dollar nor the yuan can claim universal dominance. In this context, the role of XRP, XLM, and HBAR transcends simple cryptocurrency investment. They represent potential solutions to a geopolitical standoff. As Western institutions like the IMF and World Bank consider integrating blockchain for debt issuance, aid distribution, and lending, BRICS countries are simultaneously exploring non-dollar settlement frameworks. Both paths intersect on the question of digital infrastructure. The narrative that blockchain could act as the bridge between competing power blocks gives these assets a unique positioning. Whether they are explicitly integrated into World Bank pilot projects, IMF policy frameworks, or BRICS-led trade initiatives, the underlying value proposition remains. Blockchain networks can facilitate real-time, trust-minimized settlements without the bottlenecks and political entanglements of legacy banking. Thus, the rise of a multipolar financial order creates an opening for blockchain assets like XRP, XLM, and HBAR to cement their relevance beyond speculative cycles. If the IMF and World Bank ultimately adopt neutral blockchain rails to maintain their role, and if BRICS relies on them to bypass dollar channels, then these assets could become the backbone of an entirely new financial architecture. What began as niche crypto projects may very well evolve into the connective tissue of a multipolar world economy, linking East and West, North and South, in ways traditional systems could never achieve. As the global financial system tilts toward a multipolar order, where no single power dominates monetary and trade flows, both Stellar and Ripple have started to emerge as digital networks that embody this transition. In the past, the dollar-centric framework enforced by Western financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank created a unipolar reality. Settlements, remittances, and cross-border transfers all passed through systems largely influenced by the United States and Europe, making countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America dependent on centralized gateways. But the rise of blockchain infrastructure, particularly platforms designed for cross-border settlements, offers a new framework where value can move outside the monopoly of SWIFT or correspondent banking. Ripple and Stellar are two names that consistently come up in this conversation, not just because of their technical architecture, but because of the narratives attached to them in relation to multipolar finance. Ripple has long been positioned as the bridge for banks and financial institutions. Its partnerships with entities ranging from Santander to central banks in the Middle East suggest that its goal is to reinforce institutional trust while providing faster, cheaper settlement rails. That makes Ripple a tool for governments and banks that want to maintain their role in the global system but adapt to digital assets. Stellar, by contrast, has branded itself more as the network for the unbanked, the open financial rails that anyone can use, whether in a refugee camp, an informal market, or a remittance corridor. The symmetry here is interesting. Ripple represents the top-down approach to a multipolar order, states and banks adapting to multipolar realities by embracing new payment infrastructure. Stellar represents the bottom-up approach, ordinary people, small businesses, and grassroots economies bypassing old systems altogether. The multipolar shift is not only about new powers like China, Russia, or the BRICS nations contesting U.S. influence. It is also about networks replacing geography. A Filipino worker in Dubai sending money back home does not care about the politics of IMF lending frameworks. They care about fees and speed. If Stellar can provide that service instantly, it participates in building a multipolar structure where no single hegemon controls the flows of value. Ripple, meanwhile, positions itself as the network that even powerful states can lean on when the cracks in the dollar-centric system widen. Think about a scenario where BRICS nations push for a gold-backed settlement currency. The infrastructure to support that is still immature. But Ripple's on-demand liquidity, ODL, could provide the bridge assets and transaction rails necessary for states to transact outside of SWIFT, while keeping a degree of interoperability with existing systems. Stellar's partnerships also signal its role in this order. Its integration with MoneyGram, and even pilot projects with the UN for disbursement of aid in stablecoins, point to its growing reputation as neutral rails for humanitarian and cross-border flows. In a multipolar world, aid distribution becomes a political tool. If the US gives aid through IMF channels, it often comes with conditionalities. But if the UN or NGOs begin to distribute value through Stellar, the process sidesteps national politics and puts liquidity directly in the hands of individuals. That decentralization of financial power is multipolarity in action, not just among states but among people. The competition between Ripple and Stellar could also be seen as complementary. Ripple, with its ties to banks and regulators, ensures that multipolarity does not descend into chaos. Stellar ensures that the benefits of multipolar finance are not monopolized by elites. Together, they create a dual-layer structure, Ripple for the institutional top, Stellar for the grassroots bottom. This duality mirrors the multipolar vision itself. There is no single hub or center. There are multiple nodes, each serving different interests but all interconnected. In fact, some argue that this balance between Ripple and Stellar is precisely why these projects have been tolerated. Even in the face of regulatory crackdowns in the US, Ripple's lawsuit with the SEC, though painful, also highlighted that the company is significant enough to warrant attention from regulators. Stellar, staying quieter, has continued to expand its ecosystem globally without facing the same level of scrutiny. The most compelling part of this story is that multipolarity is not a future aspiration. It is already unfolding. We see countries signing bilateral agreements to settle trade in local currencies, bypassing the dollar. We see stablecoins denominated in non-dollar currencies being issued on networks like Stellar. We see Ripple being discussed in central bank digital currency pilots in countries seeking alternatives to dollar settlements. Both networks, though not dominant in market capitalization compared to Bitcoin or Ethereum, carry narratives that align with the world's shifting order. Stellar is the people's rails in an era where populations in the global south are demanding more agency. Ripple is the institution's rails in an era where even governments outside the West want to operate with less dependence on Washington. The conclusion from all this is clear. As the multipolar order strengthens, Ripple and Stellar stand not as competitors in the usual crypto sense of which coin pumps harder, but as complementary tools shaping the architecture of global finance. Whether you are looking at the corridors of central banks or the hands of migrant workers sending remittances, these networks embody the possibility that no single power will dictate the future of value transfer. Instead, multipolarity will be expressed both through the decisions of states and the financial choices of individuals, and in both spaces, Ripple and Stellar already have a seat at the table. When you look closer at how Ripple and Stellar are actually being used, the multipolar narrative becomes less of a theory and more of a lived reality. Take the BRICS nations, for example. Their decision to build an alternative payment system independent of SWIFT has been one of the most concrete signs that the global order is moving away from US dominance. Russia, sanctioned and cut off from much of the Western banking system, has already begun experimenting with blockchain-based settlement tools. China, through its digital yuan, is laying out infrastructure that could interface with distributed networks. Ripple, with its on-demand liquidity solution, offers an efficient bridge for these countries to settle cross-border transactions without going through dollar rails. The irony here is striking. While the West debates Ripple's regulatory status, other regions are exploring how to integrate its technology into their financial systems. Stellar plays a different role in this context. If Ripple is the bridge for states and banks, Stellar is increasingly becoming the bridge for the people living in those states. Look at Africa, where remittances are often the lifeline of households. Traditional money transfer services charge anywhere between 7% and 15% in fees, and transfers can take days. Stellar's integration with MoneyGram, which allows individuals to deposit or withdraw stablecoins for cash at local agents, has already demonstrated what bypassing the old system looks like in practice. For countries in the global south where access to banking is limited, this isn't a futuristic idea, it's a tangible shift happening right now. The IMF and World Bank add another layer to this story. For decades, they've acted as gatekeepers, providing loans that came with strict policy prescriptions. But this dependency is slowly breaking. Countries frustrated with the strings attached to IMF loans are now turning toward regional solutions or experimenting with digital currency settlements. Here's where Ripple and Stellar enter the conversation. A multipolar order doesn't only weaken the dominance of the dollar, it also creates space for new infrastructure to take on roles once monopolized by the IMF and World Bank. Aid, for example, could bypass state channels and flow directly to individuals through Stellar. Ripple, meanwhile, could underpin intergovernmental settlements for trade agreements or debt restructuring, offering speed and neutrality. In fact, what we are seeing is a kind of quiet revolution in how trust is structured. Previously, trust came from institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the US dollar. In a multipolar order, trust increasingly comes from networks. Ripple and Stellar embody that transition. They do not rely on a single country's political will to function. Instead, their credibility is tied to adoption, interoperability, and efficiency. This shift explains why conversations around them keep resurfacing in geopolitical and economic circles. As multipolarity deepens, these networks aren't just passengers in the new financial order, they are part of the architecture itself. So where does all of this leave us? If you zoom out, the big picture is clear. The financial world is no longer revolving around a single sun. We're moving into a constellation of power centers, each building its own orbit. And in that constellation, Ripple and Stellar shine in very different but complementary ways. Ripple, with its institutional focus, is like the quiet backbone being considered by central banks and major trade blocs who are tired of swift choke points and dollar dependency. Stellar, on the other hand, is the people's layer, the network that proves global finance doesn't have to be elitist, slow, or expensive. Can be grassroots, borderless, and immediate. This is why conversations around a multipolar order aren't just about geopolitics. They're also about infrastructure. Whether it's BRICS setting up alternatives to Western systems, or communities in Africa and Latin America bypassing traditional banks, the shift is already underway. Ripple and Stellar don't replace the dollar or the IMF overnight, but they chip away at the monopoly of trust that those institutions used to hold. And every time a transaction clears faster on these rails, every time a family receives more of their remittance instead of losing it to fees, the world edges further into that new order. Now, for you listening right now, this isn't just abstract theory. It's something that could shape how you move money, how you invest, and even how nations interact with each other in the next decade. If you've been following Stellar and Ripple, you know this is more than just price speculation. It's about being early to understand the rails of a new financial era. If you found this breakdown helpful, here's what I want you to do. Hit that like button so more people see it, subscribe if you want to stay ahead of the noise, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. Do you think Ripple and Stellar will actually power the multipolar financial system? Or is it just another crypto narrative? Let's talk about it, because the conversation is only just beginning.